Hello, this is Barbara Blodgett, and I have the great pleasure today of talking with two people, a supervisor-intern pair. I'm happy to introduce you to the pastor, Reverend Elizabeth Michael Ross, who is pastor of Community of Reconciliation, a church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and to Shannon Garrett Headen, who is a rising senior at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and was the intern this past year at Community of Reconciliation. So to the two of you, my questions. The first one, some people ask, how can we conduct meaningful field education if the COVID crisis prevents students from having any in-person contact with people in the field?
So I would say that is just a parallel question to the question all pastors I know have been asking. How do we do ministry when we can't have the same kinds of physical presence and connection that we're used to having? I mean, I'll love for Shannon to elaborate further on her experience of this, but my own experience was that the learning for both pastor and intern just was ratcheted up intensely in mid-March as we very quickly were demanded to think about what it is that ministry is, what the church is, what the essential marks of the church are, how we were very quickly forced to pivot from kind of a whole spreadsheet of activities and things we imagine doing in our life together to what are the very core things that keep us the body of Christ. And so when it was pared down to worship, we very quickly moved most of our gatherings onto Zoom, which as a small congregation worked well for us. So in some sense, the chance to have some face-to-face time and back and forth was a pretty smooth transition. But I think the learning was right for all of us in thinking, what does it mean to be the church in this time? What are the pastoral needs of our congregation? I would argue that Shannon was no less in the field from March through May than she was all of the 6 months prior to that. Her presence with us continued to be vital and her connections clear and strong in the midst of that.
So you talked about that a lot in your weekly reflections.
We did. I remember checking in pretty regularly just as colleague with Shannon. What do you think the congregation is this week? What do you think the pastoral needs are? What does it mean to preach into this moment? How much do we preach about the pandemic and how much do we acknowledge there's a larger story to the gospel?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really tend to echo everything Elizabeth said. I mean, I think for me, in some ways it was just, I enjoyed it. Because it allowed us to kind of break away from kind of the standard, liturgical practices of church, and how can we do this different? We just had to find a space to speak into these people's lives and how to bring God, through a Zoom camera.
Yeah. Speaking of it,
lots of ways.
Frozen sometimes.
But specifically, I recall doing thinking about, I'm a youth minister at heart. So I do love youth and children. That's just what I've done most of my time in churches. And so through Zoom, we lost some of the kids. It's just harder for kids to kind of sit still and be involved. And so we were able to sit down and think about, well, how can we include the kids in? So we started doing more children's moments and inviting kids to come up and tell us what's your experience. What are you missing during the pandemic? There's something I kind of picked up along the way in youth ministry is that sometimes we just kind of forget that kids have thoughts and feelings and ideas, and the pandemic is affecting them too. And to make sure they know that this church is their church too. So just as much as the adults are, having this experience in church, it's for them too. So we did children's moments and prayers and reflections, and invited them to come in and tell their stories and what they're missing and what they're praying for. And it was a really good way to make sure they knew that they were part of this body as well.
That's great. Well, I don't think anyone has immediately answered that question by saying, I enjoyed it. So what a great testimony to the way you were able to pivot and actually find enjoyment. Sometimes people wonder about observation being, of course, an important part of field education. Shannon, do you feel that there was any difference, or do you have any guidance for anybody who's kind of wondering or curious about how to observe their intern when the intern is using an online platform to do their ministry?
Sure. My first thought is, in ministry, we're kind of used to being watched and observed and monitored in some way, and I think that's very important for formation. We do need supervisors to check in on us, because otherwise we need to identify our strengths and weaknesses, and those things can only be found through supervision. So personally, I did not find it awkward. Pastor Elizabeth set in on some of my Bible. I did Bible studies, and
Okay.
was present through some of those, and I mean it was fine, and I certainly appreciate the feedback that she was able to give me. I mean, just as she suggested, we had these weekly meetings that require a supervisor to ask the questions, to observe, to question. So for me, I found it really helpful, and would hope that people would understand how important it is for the intern, because we want to be pastors too, and we have to be able to make mistakes and learn and grow just like any other field.
Great. The final things I ask is about hours. Some people ask, should interns be held to the same number of hours as they always have? Elizabeth?
Yeah, and it's funny to think how much our sense and experience of time has shifted with the pandemic too, hasn't it? I mean, it's not just a question of counting hours, but it's how our days have gone from many of us very structured to sort of work and school and personal life all bleeding together more into the hours that are available. Shannon and I had sort of all along been doing a little bit more sort of project-based than hours-based kinds of planning, but I think when the pandemic hit, I felt keenly aware of the amount of time and energy that it was suddenly taking for all of us just to exist in this new world, where everything from figuring out how to get groceries to figuring out how to connect with a friend was just taking a lot more time and energy. So I remember pretty intentionally in our meetings just spending additional time at the beginning checking in and saying, how are you doing? How is life for you right now? Tell me about the capacity you feel like. Where is this work life giving, and where can we work together? So I'd say hours for me ceased to be kind of a goal to hit, and the questions became more about how can the work of ministry, of field education, and the wholeness of your life right now be something that God would bless, be full of Sabbath and of well-being and of flourishing insofar as any of those things are possible in the world we're living in right now.
Yeah. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but would you say that in general, even without a pandemic to think about, you tend to do your ministry in more project chunks than hour chunks?
Well, I think I came through that school that was kind of like there are 3 parts of a day and you work 2 of them. So
Okay, yeah.
That's sort of been my own model for my
I
own.
was raised on that too. Good, thanks. Shannon, any thoughts about the use of hours?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree that there was a lot of hour counting, but there was a lot of like time to like create projects, and what are we doing in worship, and what are we adding to the calendar. So like we were doing Bible studies, and someone was doing a prayer workshop, and so it wasn't so much hour based, but kind of project based, which just made it much easier to I don't know, but just to find space to create things and try to think about what could we do that people needed. It's kind of leaning away from such a kind of what hour is this? I mean, but more into like leaning into what people need in the midst of the pandemic. So we just thought about it differently.
Right. Good. Thanks. Well, I can tell folks who are watching that clearly this pair did something right, because Shannon's going to continue on at the church in the fall. And I think that what I'm hearing is that there are some things that obviously really changed and became very different, but there were a remarkable number of things that did not. Much change about your internship, which I think is a testimony to a great pairing and a great internship. You guys have any final thoughts?
Grateful for the privilege, and to the audience, grateful for all the work you all are doing in field education.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.